Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship. I'm Scott Sturt, founder and CEO of Venture for Canada, and your host. The focus of this podcast is to hear from changemakers and young Canadian entrepreneurs to learn about how they've developed their entrepreneurial mindset and skills. In Season 2, we'll be chatting with young Canadians about their unconventional career trajectories and what it's like to be young entrepreneurial leaders. I'm excited to dive into these conversations about how to foster your entrepreneurial mindset and drive. I am super excited that Sam Daviau is on A New Wave of Entrepreneurship today. Sam is the Vice President of Operations at Statflow, which is the leading business text messaging platform built for frontline teams who want to engage, retain, and grow their customer base. He is responsible for leading alliances, human resources, cross-functional strategic projects and planning, enterprise opportunity scoping, and client onboarding at Statflow. Sam is also the chair of the Venture for Canada Alumni Council and is a 2015 Venture for Canada Fellow. He also does many different things outside of that, including he has managed his brother's music career. He has been involved in launching a youth basketball charity in Toronto. He is on the board of directors of Muskoka Lakes Association. He does a lot of different things outside of Venture for Canada and is definitely outside of Statflow, and is definitely somebody who can manage a lot of different things at once. Sam, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm looking forward to this discussion with you, Scott, and thank you for that very kind intro. I'm just excited to have this conversation.
So for our listeners, Sam, can you just describe a little bit more about yourself and your background and your entrepreneurial journey to date?
Yeah, wouldn't say kind of like a pretend entrepreneur in the sense that I haven't started my own formal company before, but I've been involved and been alongside many founders and CEOs over the journey. I'm a generalist in nature, so I'm not a function specific person. So I like touching lots of different things, but I don't necessarily have the depth of other professionals who are making a specific domain their career. Ultimately I just try to do things that I care about, right? I try to get involved with things that I care about and orient both my volunteer initiatives in my career towards areas that are important to me. But from an execution perspective. So I'm not the guy who's going to set a vision for the world going forward. I'm the guy who's going to help us reach that vision.
So one thing that I'd be challenged, I'd say, to broaden the definition of is what is an entrepreneur? And I think a lot of times people think of an entrepreneur as solely somebody who launches their own company or a kind of initiative. And at Venture for Canada, we're increasingly using the definition of entrepreneurship, which comes from EntreComp, which stands for the Entrepreneurial Competency Framework, which was done by the European Union, which they define entrepreneurship as to act upon opportunities to create value for others. The value that can be created is economic, social, or environmental. All this is to say is that I think someone can be very entrepreneurial and not necessarily launch their own kind of company. So I guess one of the things that I would, my question to you, Sam, is what to you, do you agree with that definition of entrepreneurship? Like, what does to be entrepreneurial mean to you?
So I agree with that definition of an entrepreneurship, like entrepreneurship. I agree with that definition of the word entrepreneurship, and I agree that that accurately reflects the skill set that an entrepreneur would need to start their own company. However, I believe that an entrepreneur is someone who takes the risk. He or she takes the leap. He, she, or they take the leap. It is someone who it is the risk taking that gives you the notch on your belt that says you're an entrepreneur. It isn't the skill set that you have, which can be very entrepreneurial and might be very fitting for an entrepreneur. But taking the leap is what I believe would make you an entrepreneur. And it's a leap I want to take. It's a leap I've been preparing to take for a long time. So that's my perspective on entrepreneur versus entrepreneurship as a definition.
Do you think though that a lot of early stage employees, like you joined Stafflow when you were the fifth or sixth employee, or in that
Yeah,
range,
yeah, someone like that.
and you took a risk, like you joined, you could have gone to work at more established companies and organizations. Like in essence, you invested your time and a chunk of your life into the company. Wouldn't you say that early stage startup employees are taking that kind of risk? But maybe it's a different kind of risk, but it's still a risk.
Yeah, I mean, they are like, I'm not one to get lost in definition. So, if someone wants to call themselves an entrepreneur, I'm more talking about myself and how I would consider, how I would define myself. Um, power to those people. I don't think what they've done is what a person who does when they join an early stage startup and takes, the risk of joining an early stage startup is it should not be, valued, and it should not be considered. If they believe that's entrepreneurship, then they shouldn't consider it like that. Like that's totally legitimate. um for me, I guess I'm reticent to define myself as an entrepreneur until I actually go and start my own company. So, I guess it's more of a personal definition, personal reflection on where I feel I am in my career and where I feel I can be ultimately, um, and gating certain definitions for myself till I reach that goal.
As you look forward in your life and you think around launching like a new venture or organization, what are the problems that you're most passionate about tackling?
Yeah, so there's idea there's this is I think a problem in the way people start thinking about starting their own company. They think that they have to have the idea. They think that they have to have a problem that they're really passionate about, and they have to solve that problem. That's not true for me. I'm not an idea specific person. I'm not, as you can see by my career, right? Like I've jumped all over the place at Statflow. I've gone from everything from being on the board of a community organization, a community advocacy group, to, starting a charity, to managing a music business, right? Like it's in my spare time. It's varied, and there's no stream that all fits under, except for doing like execution work on things I care about. So helping deliver for the people, the communities, and the organizations that I care about. So with that in mind, I don't think it's about the idea. I don't think an idea is necessary in order for someone to become an entrepreneur. You can go and discover an idea by having a conversation with someone pretty easily, and it could be a great idea. For me, it's much more about the journey. It's much more about how do you take that idea, create a business model behind it, create a true value proposition behind it, rationalize expenses, and develop a profitable way of approaching that business, and how do you create an incredible atmosphere for your employees and your stakeholders to participate in. I'm passionate about running businesses. I'm passionate about organizations. I wouldn't say I'm passionate about any one specific idea.
It's an interesting thing to think about in terms of entrepreneurship and the concept that I think a lot of times people think they put a lot of pressure on the idea, and then there is a lot of emphasis on the idea. And a lot of the most successful entrepreneurs in Canada, for instance, they took ideas or adapted ideas from other markets. Like you look at Wealthsimple, right,
Yeah.
worth over $1 billion. They weren't the first robo advisor, but to their credit, they saw this huge opportunity with other organizations that already existed, like Wealthfront in the United States, and they saw it like a market option. Skip the dishes, right? Wasn't the first food delivery,
Yeah.
but they, a firm would or PayBright, which is sold to a firm for hundreds of millions of dollars, saw a model and adapted. And even going back into ancient history, the Romans were actually not that innovative. They in
Yeah.
many ways took the ideas from the Greeks and all these other groups, and then they
Yeah.
made them better. They just didn't copy them. So I even by the way, I'm also had to be self-aware of my own life and experience with Venture for Canada. I saw a model in the United States of a
There
charity
you go.
and thought, hey, there should be a Venture for Canada. Why doesn't it exist? It's an interesting model. Are you aware of the concept of search funds, or
I am aware of the concept of search funds. Yeah.
what do you have? So two kind of questions. First, for our listeners, can you describe what is a search fund? And then two is describe why somebody who might be entrepreneurial inclined might be interested in doing a search fund.
Yeah, and I love the concept of search funds. A search fund is a little bit like PE in a sense, private equity in a sense, where you're taking a controlling stake of an existing company, usually an existing small company, and improving the process, or having a model from a financial perspective to do acquisitions. But you're ultimately searching for a company to operate. That's what you're doing. When you're running a search fund. So you're raising a pool of capital, you bring to the table operator acumen, and you make a successful business without necessarily, trying to start the business, right? You skip the whole finding product market fit, and you skip the whole, testing lean startup methodology, and you really jump to, okay, well, this business has a couple $1 million in EBITDA. How do I go and make this into a business that is going to be $1 billion valuation, right? And you're looking for those pre-existing companies that provide a service or a platform or something that you can then go and scale and create something really great out of through operating acumen. So that's what I believe a search fund is. For anyone that doesn't have an idea, that's a great option. It's not the only option. There's lots of VCs out there that will go and they have the ideas, right? They feel like they have a hypothesis on what the market needs, and usually they're better positioned to have those hypotheses than any individual would be. And you can go and join, and as an experienced operator, to run one of their companies. There's also models where, like Entrepreneur First, where you don't go in with an idea, you go in with a skill set, and you're paired with a co-founder. So for example, I would come in with a business skill set and enterprise sales and all those things, and you'd be paired with a co-founder that I would be paired with a co-founder that's technical and knows how to build a product. And the idea comes out of a journey with partnerships to that organization. So that's another concept I've heard of. There's lots of those out there, right? People are starting to realize that it's not about the idea, it's about finding capable people to go and bring an idea into fruition. So that's more of the model I'd look at exploring for myself.
Agreed, and I think that there's so many, it's so often where people will start with an idea, and then the end business or product that's developed is completely different than the original idea
Yeah.
that was proposed.
Pivot. Pivot is like the favorite word of the startup community.
Well, and in the Toronto tech ecosystem, I think a great example of that is ADA support, where it's the
Yeah.
same entity. It was a completely different. They're a AI chatbot for our listeners, but the initial company was this company called Volley, which was this online
Yeah.
community where a venture capital fellow from the first cohort worked at. Completely different than what they
Yeah.
ended up pivoting. And they're now one of the most successful tech startups in Toronto, probably 150, 200 employees, done extremely
Yeah.
well. But it's an example of where,
Slack.
and Slack, yeah, is another great example.
Yeah. It took two tries. It did two pivots before they came up with Slack.
It's interesting around in the last kind of 5 years, the amount of new kind of on ramps that exist for entrepreneurship. I think there's programs like Venture for Canada for recent grads and current post secondary students where they can gain experiences. But for people later along, there's programs like Entrepreneur First. There's the proliferation of search funds, which are still not that common in Canada, a lot more common in the United States.
Yeah.
There are venture studios which have popped up where people can kind of co-create within a venture capital. There's the On Deck Fellowship, which a few of the different people who we've interviewed have participated in. So it's interesting to see. In many ways, while there are a lot of challenges and barriers to pursuing entrepreneurship, there's more opportunities for people to meet co-founders and to get started than there perhaps ever was before. What do you think of that kind of premise?
Yeah, I mean, and Scott, I appreciate your knowledge of the terminology around entrepreneurship. It's stronger than mine. I know of all these concepts, and I've actually looked at companies that do these things. But like Venture Studio, that's what I was talking about earlier on the venture capital side. These venture capital companies that bring people in. So it's I'm realizing the importance of terminology and precision within that terminology as I'm hearing you speak. Um, I it's a tough question. Like maybe the proliferation of this is I think a really good thing, and I'm kind of sticking my foot in my mouth here because we started to talk about how an entrepreneur needs to take a leap and needs to take risk, and fundamentally these organizations are reducing the risk that entrepreneurs need to take in order to start a company. So I think it's a really healthy thing for the ecosystem. I think it's great, but yeah, and breaks down the barriers, breaks down accessibility to entrepreneurship, right? There's this whole philosophy in entrepreneurship that it's not, your ability to take risk is not dependent on who you are as a person, right? Like it's not dependent on your skill set. It's not dependent on your character. It's dependent on your financial background. Yeah, it's much easier to take a risk if, like frankly, if I took a risk and I screw up royally, I'm not going to be on the street, right? Like I have my family, I have people supporting me, um, I have the ability to, go back and work professionally, and I have a network that I can tap into for that. But if you don't have that network, if you don't have that support, it becomes a lot more risky on a personal level to become an entrepreneur. So I think from an accessibility perspective, these organizations and these concepts is really healthy for the ecosystem and will make entrepreneurship more accessible to those groups that might not be able to access entrepreneurship today.
I agree, and I think that there's still, while there's more paths to pursuing entrepreneurship than ever, in many ways there's more systemic barriers for people to pursue entrepreneurship. There's a great study from the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, which basically they studied the correlation between student debt levels and decreased entrepreneurial activity, and there's a strong correlation that exists. And there's
Yeah,
lots of
not
research
surprised.
that shows, which is in the sense that if somebody owes $80,000 in student debt, just logically
Yeah.
they're going to be a lot less likely to pursue entrepreneurship. And the same goes is if somebody comes from a family or community where there's a lack of entrepreneurial role models, or where they're not seeing themselves represented in a community, there are systemic barriers that exist. And yeah, I think you bring up a really important point and it's really core to kind of vision of Venture for Canada, which is that imagine as a society and as a world, if everybody had more of an equal opportunity to pursue entrepreneurship, the unlocked potential that would exist.
Mhm.
And when you look at who's raising money, or you're looking at the current ecosystem, there's a huge opportunity to diversify that, and that's definitely a core part of Venture for Canada's diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. So I definitely
Yeah, no, I mean,
what
speaking to
resonates.
that, I mean, yeah, speaking to that on more of a micro level, like that's what we're doing with the annual giving committee, right, Scott? Like, I mean, we're trying to make the fellowship more accessible to people who otherwise wouldn't have what it wouldn't be accessible to. So I'm very proud to be a part of that, and I'm excited about that strategy that VFC has, and I think it makes complete sense.
Yeah, and it's the not to give too much of a plug, but this is a good opportunity. We are Venture Canada is raising funds towards scholarships that support individuals with financial barriers to participate in the fellowship program, of which Sam is an integral part of that effort, and appreciative of Sam's engagement on many fronts. And this actually presents a good segue to talking a little bit about Sam's kind of involvement with Venture for Canada over the past couple of years. So Sam has been a super active volunteer with Venture for Canada since pretty much the very beginning. Sam, I was thinking back
Yeah.
to the early days of Venture for Canada, and I remember calling you one day. This is probably when a year or two into the fellowship. You probably remember this conversation, and you were like, Scott, I think we would chat like almost every I've gotten a call from you like every month for like this isn't the first year of Venture for Canada. We had chatted a ton, and now you chat a lot with
Yeah.
Juanita. But yeah, you played a huge role in engagement. So a few different kind of questions. First one is, can you describe to for our listeners a little bit the role of Venture for Canada Alumni Council, what you do, what are your kind of upcoming plans and initiatives, but also on a much broader note is how does it something why is community important, and how do you think that the Venture for Canada community, the community of fellows, helps people in their personal and professional development?
Yeah. So, big question. I'm going to start on the Alumni Council and kind of move into some of the further along questions. And I'll ask you for a reminder on the exact way you phrase those questions a little bit further down. But to answer the first part, which is what does the Alumni Council do? The Alumni Council engages alumni, to put it as simply as possible. Our job is to foster the community that is a stakeholder within VFC, which is the alumni, the micro community, right? So it's a piece of the broader Venture for Canada community, which includes employees, partners, donors, all the different people. Alumni is one of those stakeholders, and over time is becoming a more and more important part of VFC. So in 2017 or 2018, even 2018, when I started talking about this, there was only two classes that graduated. There was like 100 alumni, less than 100 alumni, right? So for Venture for Canada to go and say, okay, like this is an important stakeholder group at this time, didn't make much sense, and I agreed. I agree with that. But over time, now we have upwards of 200 alumni, and those people are getting further and further along in their career. They're leaders at their companies. They're starting their own companies. They're raising millions of dollars. They're going back to universities and schools to do masters and PhD programs and MBAs. They're a group of incredible people, right? VFC was their launching platform, but the paths that some of these alumni have taken are really, really incredible. And VFC, plug for VFC here. VFC has a lot of content published about alumni, and Scott, you're obviously doing these podcasts with alumni. So if you want to learn about that group, that micro community, I'd encourage you to check out VFC's content. But with that in mind, as the alumni become a larger group, their value to the VFC community, and I'm not just talking about their economic value, which there is a significant portion of that, but their value to the community from an ability to give back to learning and mentorship, and the ability for them to engage and enhance the programming that that Venture for Canada delivers to fellows and interns. I could go off for a while on this, but it's increasing. It's increasing dramatically and exponentially, both because you get more alumni every single year, and alumni get further along in their career every year. But there's an engagement issue fundamentally, right? Alumni, after they're finished the fellowship program, aren't formally there's no formal accountability that goes and engages those people before the alumni council. So the alumni council plays a pivotal role in bringing those alumni back into the community and ensuring that those relationships and that network doesn't end after the fellowship.
And why, to the question about kind of the importance of communities in general, one of the things when
Right.
we survey Venture for Canada fellows, the number one thing that always comes up, we're going to do a word cloud of people's benefits of Venture for Canada. Community is definitely always the number one word that comes up. So, what are some of the benefits of Venture for Canada community? But beyond Venture for Canada, regardless, just in general, like why is it important that someone's intentional about fostering community and being an engaged community member as they approach their career?
Yeah, I mean, people aren't happy ultimately. I mean, someone can debate this with me, but people aren't happy ultimately because they got a promotion. People are happy when they tell people they got a promotion. People are happy when they see other people's reactions when they get a promotion. People are happy because of the social proof of doing that. That's not everyone. There are highly introverted people who don't need as much social validation. I'm not one of those, but I've been told that there are those people, and who am I to say otherwise? But I would say the majority of people get value from where they fit in the community, get happiness from where they fit in the community, and get happiness from those relationships they develop in the community. On a personal note, my girlfriend's a 2016 alumni, right? So for me, engaging with the Venture for Canada community had a result that was way, way, way beyond any happiness I would achieve through my career, right? It's the most loved person in my life. It's my partner. So, with that in mind, it's not even a question that the community has value beyond a professional element, and that community has value for individuals. So, I mean, there's a lot we could talk about within this, but at its core, people get value from being around other people, and that's also why COVID's so challenging. But I'm going to go into a hole here if I start discussing that. But I think I answered your question.
The pandemic has definitely demonstrated the important, like I think people appreciated the importance of social bonds before the pandemic, but to me, as a relatively introverted person who liked a fair amount of alone time, I found this pandemic really hard. It probably made me realize I'm more of an extrovert sometimes than I realized I was. And that relationships are so important in life. There's a great book by Clayton Christensen, who was a noted Harvard Business School professor who coined disruptive innovation and was a theorist in many aspects of management. And his book, How to Measure Your Life, he talks about ultimately in all these kind of studies of happiness that the happiest people when they're dying and they're thinking around their life, it's the quality of their relationships, and it's their social bonds with other people. And to your point, that's why I think a community is so important. Somebody can be really successful in a traditional sense, but if they don't have that community, if they don't have strong relationships, if they don't have that strong sense of connection, then they're sometimes left with a sense of emptiness, and perhaps less happy in the long run. So I also think I'd be interested in your thoughts on this as well. As one thing that comes up from Venture for Canada fellows is the extent to which, if you're in a what our counterparts of Venture for America describe as like a high ambition environment. So if you're in an environment in a community where people are striving and they're constantly encouraging and cheerleading for people to like be a better version of themselves, that it makes everybody in the community kind of stronger. So what's your thoughts about that in terms of kind of community, your experiences with Venture for Canada, and yeah, just in general?
yeah, so there's a balance there. Having gone to business school, having, strived for that type A type of job out of business school, originally, you know, there's something to be said about not being surrounded by A-type personalities, and and happiness that provides. I think you have to be careful with the level of competition that you have within your social circle. So there's a healthy way of doing it, and there's an unhealthy way of doing it. What you described is healthy, great, right? Everyone's striving for each other. No one's judging each other. No one's comparing themselves against each other. Everyone's supportive of each other's initiatives. As a new grad, when you come out of school as a new grad, often you don't have that mindfulness to be able to not get caught in the rat race a little bit and not compete with people. And if you constantly surround yourself by top performers and A-type personalities, you're going to end up feeling not so great about yourself, because no one can beat everyone at everything. And if you're trying to beat everyone at everything, yeah, that's not a path to happiness. So, I think there's two sides of the coin there. So I think you have to be conscious in the way you're going to set up that community and ensure that it is meant for support and it's not meant for judgment and competition. So there's something to be said on both sides there, I'll say.
I empathize a ton with what you said, both from my own life experience of going to a competitive private school in high school, where members of my debating team, ended up going to Princeton and all these kind of competitive, environments, and we're just really type A. And even in high school, I would sleep 5 hours a night just to kind of try to keep up with the Joneses and work so hard. And same thing in university. At Georgetown, it was such a competitive environment that I was I way overextended myself at certain semesters, and to the extent that I was sleeping like 4 hours a night one semester, and the only time
Sounds
in my life
terrible.
I've had like a panic attack, and then I realized that basically at a certain point, like you can't measure, you can't. It's not just about keeping up with Joneses and pushing yourself to the limit. So I agree. I think that there's this like
So
fine
I
line.
have a question, Scott. I have a question for you. Did at any point within that experience, do you feel like what you did, for sure, you gained skills that allowed you to found Venture for Canada and be where you are today, but do you feel like pushing yourself that hard, right? I'm not saying that you couldn't have pushed yourself. You should push yourself, and you should push yourself to a certain degree. But do you think pushing yourself that hard had a huge incremental benefit to where you are today in your career?
No, I regret. I think that the I for like around 2 years of university, I pushed myself way too hard. I did way too many different things. There was a lot of great learnings in that, but there were some of the things I could have cut in retrospect.
Right,
Different
right.
student involvements and things that I did, and at a certain point of just hours worked, there's like diminishing returns. So, by the way, good job on turning it to me. You're the first guest who's successfully been able to ask me a question, but it's good. It's a sign of
Thanks,
a
Scott.
good conversation. So, in terms of your question though, I think it's a really it's an important one of, and I think that it's a line that a lot of entrepreneurial type A ambitious people have is between self development and then pushing somebody to a level of breaking, right? And I think it's that you
Right,
want to. It's like if you're exercising, you want to push yourself so you're improving your fitness and you're getting better, but you don't want to get an injury.
right.
And I found, at a certain point, I got injury. It was completely unsustainable. And I think a lot of it comes down to community. Like in particular, Georgetown, it was just so competitive and so many Type A people and not particularly supportive. So it was all about like, what internship did you? Probably similar to maybe at McGill, but there was a
Oh,
lot
yeah,
of
yeah. Sounds
competition.
similar.
What internship did you get? And it created this pressure that just became overwhelming in retrospect.
Yeah, yeah.
But I agree. I think that the way the community, I think within Venture for Canada, at least the comments we get from fellows, is that there's more of this, not a zero sum. Like it's people, if one person wins, it's not viewed as like a loss by, do you know what I mean? Like that it
I
helps the
totally
community
agree.
grow.
I think I think at least with my experience in my fellowship, and then since then as an observer from other fellowships, and as a mentor for other fellows, I feel the same way. I think, yeah, VFC was the first community that I was really a part of. Like, I didn't have that in university. I mean, I had, the nice part about university is I didn't live with like the people who I was competing in school with, right? Like, it wasn't all business students. I was living with like a history major and a philosophy major and then like, an English major. So for me, it was like, okay, like like we're all different. We're all doing different things. Like, we come home at the end of the day and we're not talking about school and stuff like that. So at school, I had my friend group and my real community in school was not the same as my working group, like my working community. So that's a bit of a difference, um, but Venture for Canada was the first professional kind of community where it was like everyone is, I am really, really close as a friend to these people. But I'm also not competing with them, but I'm also, growing with them and supporting them. And we're all kind of entering the same world. And you could draw comparisons between us, but no one really did, right? Everyone was there for each other. And I think that's why VFC, you see such great relationships at an individual level at VFC. Something that the Alumni Council is not worried about, and something that I don't think we have to do, is increase the one-on-one connections between VFC alumni, because those were ingrained in stone when went throughout the fellowship and throughout training camp. So, I strongly believe that VFC's community is not the quote unquote super chicken community. And I can reference an article on the super chicken philosophy.
What is
But
the
the point
super
is,
chicken
it's
philosophy, Sam? Just for kind of listeners, I'm not familiar with
super
the term.
chicken is if you put a bunch of, so my CEO sometimes says this, and I agree with him. You put a bunch of normal chickens in a room. So there's this whole study done where they took these chickens that were especially strong and big and leaders of the chicken pack, the coop, and they put them all together and they killed each other. They didn't, they didn't help each other. Right. And the thought is, if you have all these amazing people together, you're going to get more eggs, or you're going to get more of whatever the production is that you're trying to get out. But the reality is, if you don't manage that really well, these people are just going to get into conflict with each other. But if you put one super chicken with a bunch of normal chickens in the room, which very bad analogy to compare people to chickens, but aside from that, if you put a super chicken in a room and a bunch of normal chickens, then the normal chickens all get better in whatever way they were measuring this. So that's the loose concept of it. I can't, I'll have to send you the article afterwards, because it gets more into the actual science behind it.
That's an interesting concept I've not heard of. I'm already thinking the title of this episode, the super chicken theory. No, that will not be. But it is an interesting kind of concept. So shifting gears kind of chronologically from graduating from McGill to working at Stafflo. So you've been at Stafflo for 6 years. You've had numerous different roles, and you've continued to gain more and more responsibility and
Yeah.
continue to progress. Now, I'm 29, and I think of a lot of my different friends who've since I graduated. There's some people I know who in the span of 7 years have had like 5, 6 jobs. Like they go, and there's probably a lot of people like that. Like they go job to job to job to job. What do you think are
Yeah.
the pros of sticking at a company and growing with it over time and gaining more and more responsibility versus people who do very frequent job hopping?
Yeah, I mean, so I lucked out, I'll be honest. I lucked out because I joined a company where, the founder was supportive of growth and supportive of me being invested in the company like an owner, right? Supportive of me setting up my comp framework so that I could feel like an owner. And, I joined a company that was willing to experiment, and a company that cared about people. I got lucky, and it's not, don't get me wrong, I interviewed lots, and I tried to talk to people and make the decision on which company to join out of school. But often it's just pure luck, especially when you don't have a lot of experience to draw from, which you don't after coming out of university, unless you're doing that later on in your life. So, I got very lucky. So not everyone will be able to do what I'm about to say, but I feel that if you can stick at a company, and if growth is prioritized at that company, and if you're allowed to experiment in different roles, you end up building a lot of different functional skills over time, and you end up getting a lot more value ultimately, because I would have not, if I left StatFlow as a salesperson or as a product person, there's no way I would have been a VP in 5 or 6 years as the company grew. So, I'm only a VP because there's so much institutional context I have at StatFlow, and there's a lot of trust in what I can do at StatFlow. And the company helped me grow into my role today. So as the company grew, there became more opportunities, and I was already situated. I already had context. I already had background. And that puts me ahead of an external candidate, where you need to onboard them, you need to give them context, you need to do all these things. It gives you a step up in terms of recruitment, in terms of talent management. So for me, I feel like if you can find, and this is a big if you can find a supportive company that is also going to be successful, or at least somewhat successful, and grow over time, and you can be positioned within that company to grow with the company, then you can accelerate your career much more quickly than jumping around to different opportunities. Jumping around to different opportunities, for sure, there's an element of, you're going to have more new experiences, you're going to have more potentially domain knowledge in a specific field, right? Like if I work at a B2B SaaS company and then I switch to a more consumer-facing SaaS company, I have more depth of knowledge, and I'm very specific to sales, right? I'm going to have more. Well, it's not that a good example, but anyway, you're going to have more depth of knowledge in sales. Because you have more experiences to draw from, and you're doing less repeatable activities, right? You're changing your habits, and you're changing your daily activities more often, but you're going to be less strategic to that company because you have much less institutional context, and you're not going to understand organizational change as nearly as well, which in many ways is more important if your goal is to be a leader, than having the broadest domain knowledge. You can hire someone that is an expert in a specific domain, and you can contract someone, and you can have a consultant, and if you have a good network, you can talk to people and learn pretty quickly how to do something well, but or at least adequately enough in order to suffice. So it's when having the ability to be on that journey, see the journey, having the grit to live it through bad times and good times, and understanding how organizational change happens, and learning about how organizations grow. That type of learning is a lot more important ultimately for a leader to have, I believe. So if your path is to be a leader, I believe in many ways staying at a company will allow you to become a leader more quickly. But if your goal is to be the best marketer in the world, I don't know if that's true.
I agree. I think that there's I guess a few different points I'd say is, the first is that I think there's, and one thing that has been a recurring theme in this podcast series is the importance of developing generalist skills. Particularly if someone wants to be entrepreneurial, and that a great way to do that is staying at a company for a while. Second points is that I think, and this kind of expands a little bit on something you talked about, but I think that somebody just develops a lot of social capital and trust and relationships when you stay at an organization for a long time, and institutional knowledge, which allows you to take on more responsibility and grow and develop. And I mean, I founded Venture for Canada, but I've been doing Venture for Canada full time for 7 years, and stuff compounds, relationships compound, knowledge compounds, domain specific expertise compounds. And I think a challenge with a lot of recent grads, including myself when I was 22, is that I think a lot of times there's a Bill Gates quote, which we often will mention at Venture for Canada, which is basically that people often overestimate what they can do in 3 years, but they underestimate what they can do in 10. And I think it's an interesting thing to think about in the sense that building something, and I'm sure you can you reflect on this in Stafflow, takes a long time. And that it takes sometimes sticking through a long time to really create that long-term impact. The third point is to say around job hopping is I think that it's interesting to think around intentional job hopping versus unintentional job hopping. So I think if somebody is really intentional of saying they're leaving a job because they're not being given learning opportunities, or they're floundering, right? The current job they're in is not a good fit, so they move to a new job. And they move to that new job because it aligns with their career goals. It aligns with new skills that they want to do. That can make more sense. I think a challenge with a lot of people is they do unintentional job hopping. So if something bad happens at work, they get upset and they make an emotional decision to quit their job or to start applying for other jobs, and they don't really focus on trying to fix the problem because it's just easier to move, right? It's just easier to leave and quit. So it's interesting. It's to say that I think, yes, leaving jobs sometimes makes sense, but do it in an intentional and strategic way. And I think a lot of people at the beginning of the career, there's room for improvement on that.
Yeah, and there's two things that makes me think of. I mean, your last comment, number 3, is all about grit, right? It's maybe the most important skill in a lot of ways that an entrepreneur can have. The ability to stick things through, the ability to push through when there's ambiguity, uncertainty, discomfort, whatever it might be. So grit is an essential skill of entrepreneurship. I believe that through and through. And the other thing it made me think of is velocity and like flow state and whatever you want to call it, the ability to do things better and better and better and better over time as you get deeper and deeper and deeper into something is continuously building, right? So the minute you interrupt that and you go and you say, well, you change your job is a huge interruption to the velocity in your own career. And if you're not really intentional about it, and you're not thinking through how you're going to do that change in advance, it's something that is going to definitely hurt your ultimate growth. So I think you can apply velocity to personal growth and professional growth as well.
I agree, and definitely recommend people read up about flow state. And I'm mispronouncing his last name, but it's a long Hungarian last name. It's Leminski, but anyway, it's very hard to pronounce Hungarian.
I don't know it.
Many different consonants. But he has a great book called Flow that I recommend people check out. And on the topic of flow and books, and this is the final question. I feel like, Sam, we could go on. I could ask you questions for another hour or two. But my final question for today is, what are 2 or 3 books that you recommend our listeners check out, and why do you recommend them?
Well, to comment on I'll answer that question, and you're not going to like my answer, Scott, knowing you. But in terms of conversations, if you want to talk for an hour or two, Scott, you're still free to give me a call on a monthly basis if you want, and I'm always happy to chat for hours and hours if you want. So I'm totally open to continuing this discussion, not on air. But in terms of your question on books, I don't think people should read books, at least not to educate themselves. I think books are overrated and take a really long time. And Scott, this is why you're going to hate this answer. I think books for enjoyment are great. There's nothing like losing yourself in a good novel and and expanding your vocabulary and learning a story and relating to characters, and there's nothing like that in that that depth of entertainment that you get from it, and that depth of release and transporting yourself to another world. That's awesome. So I'm a fan of reading books from that perspective. But if you're reading a book for knowledge, read the Coles Notes, read the summaries, read the things that give you the knowledge quickly, without necessarily all the words. So I'm a big believer in Blinkist, and whenever someone ever tells me to read a book, I download it on Blinkist and I read the 14-minute summary. That's just I find a better way. A big fan of Medium articles, big fan of reading things that are like not long form essays so much, but like long New York Times articles that get really deep in a subject. But in terms of just reading a book, I find it very, at least for informational purposes, I find it very, I'm a guy who loves to focus on something for a long period of time. And I find reading a more technically oriented book challenging. So I was always the guy to get summaries of textbooks in school and read the summary, and study from that. So that's my personal philosophy. I won't bore you with I won't, rather than bore you, I won't embarrass myself with quoting the types of books I do read, like full books I do read, because they're all like sci-fi, fantasy, entertainment books.
That's some of the most enjoyable. A lot of listeners, I can imagine, like sci-fi. And by the way, sci-fi, I think, there's Yuval Harari of the noted Israeli author. He talks about how sci-fi is actually one of the most important genres to read for fostering creativity and entrepreneurial spirit. So what are don't feel the need to.
So I'm a sci-fi guy. I love sci-fi. The most recent one I've read was the Dark Ages is the most recent novel from him, but Golden Sun is the second one. I'm trying to think of the name of the first one. Red Rising. It's the Red Rising. It's not even a trilogy. It's 6 books now, or the 6th book is going to come out. But if you want to lose yourself in a novel that's not particularly, you're not going to run into any words in there that are overly complex. It's very, grade 5 English type of thing. Not quite grade 5, but almost. And you want to just get lost in a novel and you're really looking for a story, go for it. But warning in advance, there's violence in it, and it's very out there, and it's extremely entertaining. More entertaining than watching any Netflix show. I'll say that for sure.
One takeaway from this conversation, Sam, is you're definitely a contrarian thinker, but it's good. The world needs contrarian thinkers. I've asked this question about books many times outside this podcast and others, and it was definitely the only time I have specifically received this kind of answer. And I actually agree partially with you. I think that I remember I once asked this, he's a multi-billionaire Canadian entrepreneur, and I asked him what his favorite business book was, and he said the same thing. He said, I don't read business books, it's a waste of time. He's like, I read the article that was published in Harvard Business Review by the author that summarizes, and that gives, or he's like, I read the first chapter and that gives the point. I think a challenge with a lot of business books is they use they just go on long long examples of there's the little bit of theory for a few paragraphs, and then it's an anecdote about some random person for the rest of the chapter. And then I'm like, okay, I don't need all these anecdotes. I just want the theory. So I agree with you on that. What I would say though is that there's lots of studies that show this, is that there's huge benefits to reading. I mean, in particular, fiction. I also am a big fan of history, and I think history actually can be really valuable for reading and for understanding the world. And in many ways, history, there's elements. Obviously, it actually happened, but there can be parallels, I think, to reading literature in different ways. But right now, I'm reading A Little Life, which
history
is
a bit like a novel.
Yeah,
Sorry, I
exactly. It
interrupted
can
you
be.
there, Scott.
No, I agree. It's totally can be like a novel. But I've
Yeah.
been reading a fiction February, kind of where I'm only reading fiction this month. And, I think one of the things that's interesting is I'm reading this novel, Little Life, which is beautifully written, but also one of the most depressing novels, which perhaps is not the best for reading during the midst of a
Yeah.
pandemic. But and it just makes me think about all these different subjects and empathize. And I think what I've been reading a little bit about the link between fiction and empathy and creativity and all these things. So I would challenge a little bit in the sense that I think reading for fun, which it is if you're just reading fiction and things,
Yeah.
yes, it's for fun, but it actually has a lot of practical positive
Oh, I'm
benefits.
not disagreeing with that. I'm a big believer in you like before you go to bed, pick up your novel, read for a half hour, an hour. It's a wonderful thing to do if you're, have a lot of spare time on a weekend or on a day off. Yeah, read a book all day. That's great. Just don't read a business book all day long. That is not as great. That's all I'm saying. I think the skills that reading builds, I think the enjoyment that it brings and the release of your regular day, your regular world by losing yourself in a book, I'm a huge fan of. When I was a kid, I used to like turn out books daily. So like I remember the last Harry Potter book, which was a massive book. I read in one day and I just like did not leave my room for 12 hours. And I just read a book and I did that repeatedly when I was a kid, constantly. I literally probably read 150 to 200 books a year, but none of those books, not one of them, was a factual business book. They were all sci-fi, fiction, or fantasy books.
Oh, I empathize. I also loved the Harry Potter books as a kid. Lord of the Rings, it was also a
Yeah,
fantastic.
Lord of the Rings is great too.
Redwall. As a younger kid, I'm not sure if you ever read the
Yeah,
Redwall with the, I believe, squirrels. In retrospect, it was a little bit of
yeah,
a strange, but
yeah.
yeah, I remember all those ones. So anyway, it's been fascinating and super interesting chatting with you as always, Sam. We covered a lot of different topics today, from your experiences with Venture for Canada to talking about communities and the super chicken theory, which is an interesting one, which I've never heard of, but we'll definitely be
I'll
looking at
send you
that
the
more.
article. I'll have to find the article and send it to you.
I look forward to checking it out. To talking about kind of someone's entrepreneurial career path to switching and job hopping to science fiction. I think that you're very unique, and I think to some extent contrarian thinker, and I think that in many ways some of the most entrepreneurial people are very contrarian. And sometimes will think against the grain. So really interesting insight, Sam, and a pleasure getting to know you over the last 6 years. I can't believe it's already been 6 years.
Yeah, I know. It's a long time. I don't feel like training camp was 6 years ago.
Yeah, I know. Time, it definitely does fly, especially as one gets older. So thanks so much for coming on and have a wonderful evening. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much for having me, Scott. Loved chatting with you and looking forward to many more chats not on air.
That's it for this week's episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our social and our email list. Subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss our next episode. If you have feedback on today's episode, tweet us at Venture4Canada. That is Venture, the number 4, Canada, or email us at podcast@venture4, that's spelled FOR, Canada.ca. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. I'm Scott Stewart, and until next time, stay safe, stay motivated, and stay grateful. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is produced by Juanita Lee Garcia and Latifa Farah. Editing and mixing also done by Latifa Farah. Erica Ormanston is our editorial assistant. Mark Wallach and Premium Beat own the copyright and publishing rights related to the song used in this podcast. The comments and opinions, recommendations, or suggestions expressed on the podcast by the guests are not liable to Venture for Canada and belong solely to each individual. Any information provided stated by our guests and our host is independent of Venture for Canada. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is a Venture for Canada brand and all content is owned by Venture for Canada. If you'd like to use our content, please reach out to us at podcast@venture4, that's spelled FOR Canada.ca.